Just going to share my screen. Can you see that? It takes away.
Yeah, that's good. I can see it.
Cool. I just can't see the bottom of my other. There we go. Okay. Okay. Slideshow. There we are. You can see that.
Yep, all good. Thanks, Claire.
Perfect. Well, I'd just like to welcome everyone to our August Masterclass. For those of you that don't know, my name is Claire and I'm the Programs Lead at Vets for Climate Action. Tonight we'll be hearing from our amazing Dr. Jeremy Watson. But before I continue, I would just like to acknowledge and pay respects to our First Nations peoples, past, present and emerging. Traditional owners have cared for this country upon which we work and meet for over 60,000 years. Its lands, oceans, rivers, and its trees and wildlife. We endorse the Uluru Statement and acknowledge this land has never been ceded. Just a few housekeeping things. This webinar will be recorded and shared after those events for those who are unable to attend. I will ask that you please have your microphone muted during the presentation, and please either post any of your questions you have in the chat window or leave them for the Q&A, which happens at the end. If we do happen to miss your question, I will pop in an email address, which is info@vfca.org.au into the chat. And you please feel free to email any questions you have and we'll do our best to get back to you and answer those. Just for those of you that don't know about Vets for Climate Actions, for those present, we represent concerned veterinarians, veterinary nurses, practices and industry partners across Australia who want climate action. We hold a unique place in the heart of communities because veterinary professionals are highly trusted, spanning multiple fields with expertise in livestock, wildlife, and pet health and welfare, epidemiology, public health, and the environment. Veterinarians can comfortably talk to millions of Australians about the health of animals, the importance of stable environments, and the urgent need for climate action. We are working to inspire and educate both within the veterinary profession and beyond to the wider community. We are working together to promote sustainable veterinary care, in large part through our Climate Care program, which is a world-first management tool designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase sustainability in the veterinary practice. The program consists of a series of online modules designed for a busy veterinary team and includes Australia's very first carbon calculator, designed by vets and vet nurses specifically for the veterinary profession. At Vets for Climate Action, we are the voice for all Australian animals, and we invite you to become a champion in your community and strengthen that voice. Just the agenda for tonight, and our presenter is Dr. Jeremy Watson. Dr. Jeremy Watson chairs our Vets for Climate Action Climate Care Advisory Committee and is an enthusiastic advocate for net zero in the veterinary sector. Jeremy recently co-authored The Path to Net Zero Carbon Emissions for Veterinary Practice, published in the Frontiers in Veterinary Science 2023. And Jeremy has presented to numerous conferences on this topic, on this exciting and rapidly evolving topic. As I said, please have your microphone muted. Please post any questions in the chat. If we miss your question, I'll pop that info in the chat bar as well. This webinar will be recorded if you would not like to have your video, and that's completely fine and up to you. All right, Jeremy, you take it ahead. I will stop sharing my screen now.
All right, great. Thanks, Claire. I'll just get my screen share happening.
Mm-hmm.
How's that looking? Is that good?
That's great, Jeremy.
I'll just get some of my end sorted. All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for taking the time out tonight to have a look at this very important topic, I think, in the veterinary profession. And it really represents an evolution of the climate care program, the sustainability and net zero program that we've been developing. And net zero is now becoming more and more into the public domain, particularly with some impending legislation, which you'll hear about tonight. And once we start to explore net zero, it can open up a whole lot of opportunities for your practice, which I'm going to demonstrate tonight. And, and hopefully you can build on what we've learned and develop new areas within your practice because you are driven by a net zero strategy. And I'll just get my pointer working here. So just this photograph is taken from the front of our clinic where I work, the Brimbank Veterinary Clinic, earlier this year. And this person here is Dr. Raphael Le Guenz, and he is president of the World Veterinary Association. He visited Australia and came and visited our clinic earlier in the year. He's interested in what we are doing in Australia as veterinarians to deal with climate change. And he had one parting message that he wants to spread to us and to veterinarians worldwide, is that we need to move from climate awareness to climate action. And so net zero is absolutely about climate action, and that's what I'm going to present to you tonight. So a little bit about an overview of the presentation tonight. So we'll first of all look at some definitions: sustainability, net zero, One Health, and how they all intersect. Then we're going to have a look at the climate science update and how we're travelling and how we need to really get moving if we're going to make a significant change to dealing with climate change. Then the strategic role we as vets can play. And then we'll briefly have a look at some of the specifics in the climate care program. And then we're going to have a look at what a net zero strategy is and how you can apply it. And net zero, as I will sort of demonstrate, is really about systems analysis, and one good system to apply it to within your practice is to your system of anaesthesia. And so you'll see how it's benefited our practice by having a net zero strategy to drive change. And then lastly, I'll have a look at a few brief goals that we might set for the profession. Okay, so a little bit about some definitions. And sustainability is a term that we hear quite often in a whole lot of different contexts. And the actual UN definition of sustainability is actually meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, which is a little bit more complicated. So I've tried to simplify it here. And it's really about not leaving any waste in the air, the water, or the land that will have any impact on future generations at all. So in practical terms, for veterinary practice, sustainability is really about not making any waste. And if we look at the waste that's coming out of our veterinary practice, we actually produce about 2.5 tonnes of physical landfill waste. And that's the waste that everyone lives with on a day-to-day basis and is appalled by the amount of single-use products that we use in veterinary practice. But we also generate through the activities of our business about 110 tonnes of carbon waste or carbon emissions. And so that's by far the biggest waste coming out of our practice. And as we know, it's the carbon emissions that are really driving climate change. And that's what we need to do something about. And so we also, when we start to look at all the waste coming out of a practice, the landfill and the carbon emissions, that you can actually put a carbon value to all the waste. And so this enables us to start measuring and prioritising the different wastes in practice and start to formulate a strategy around that. And so that really brings us to what net zero is about. And really net zero is about reducing the emissions in practice to as low as possible. And ideally, when you get to maybe about the last 10%, then you might look at buying carbon credits. And carbon credits represent the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere somewhere else away from your practice, and you buy the carbon credits to neutralise that last 10% of emissions from your practice. But really the focus at the moment should really be on emissions reduction. That's where you should be putting your time and energy, and the carbon credits are going to come down the track. And then if we look at, we hear about One Health, obviously in the academic sector, but also in the corporate sector now. One Health is a widely established paradigm. And just if you look at this Venn diagram on the right here, and I've put net zero within sustainability because really if you can get most of your carbon emissions in your practice to zero, you're going to solve most of your sustainability ambitions. So really, net zero is really the focus we want to have if we want to achieve sustainability. And then if we look at the One Health paradigm, that we have environmental health, and obviously sustainability and net zero sits within that. And then the intersection with animal health and human health, and ultimately where the three meet is about One Health. And you can see here that we've got net zero absolutely front and center there of the three domains, because we know that climate change is going to have the hugest impact on human health, animal health, and environmental health. And net zero is about dealing with climate change. And so that's where it should sit within the One Health paradigm. So now what I do want to do is have a look at where we are with the climate science, a little bit of the past, the present, and the future. And so this graph on the left here is taken from an excellent webinar, which you can get on the VFCA website, by Professor Mark Howden, and he's an ANU climate scientist. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and he also sits on the board of the VFCA. And this is a really, really clever study that was done in 2008. And what they did is they collected gas bubbles from ice core samples, and they used radiocarbon dating to measure the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years. And so you can see this red graph line here indicates how the level of carbon dioxide fluctuated in the atmosphere. It never went above 300, so 300 parts per million. So it went up and down about 8 times in that time period. And when we have these troughs, we have an ice age. And when we have these peaks, we have a warm period. So there's roughly about 8 ice ages over the last 800,000 years. And then you can see the really big change has been in the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, and we've seen a rapid increase of carbon emissions, now up to 420 and continuing to rise steadily. So it's never been this high in the last 800,000 years. So we really are in uncharted territory as far as carbon emissions go. And I guess you could assume maybe from this graph that when carbon dioxide levels go up, atmospheric temperatures go up, and from the bottom here to the top here is about 6 degrees of atmospheric temperature. And that's exactly what we're seeing with 2023 now being declared the warmest global temperature on record. So temperatures are starting to climb. And the other thing I think from this graph is that this change in carbon emissions, this rapid increase, has occurred in a very narrow time frame compared to this timescale. And so it's going to take some time for all of these changes to play out. So we're only really just starting to see the beginnings of this rapid rise in carbon emissions. If we look over here on the right, and this is taken from the Climate Action Tracker in 2022. I've checked the projections and they're still pretty much the same. And what it shows is our carbon emissions have been gradually rising up until about 2030. That little dip there is COVID. And then they're giving us some various projected scenarios of where we might be headed. Now, you may have all heard of the Paris Agreement, which is to try and keep our emissions down to 1.5 degrees here. And so this is how we've got to start reducing emissions if we want to stay within the Paris Agreement. So it's a pretty rapid drop between now and 2030 if we want to stay at that 1.5 degrees of warming. Unfortunately, the reality of all the policies and actions that have been committed to by governments, but they haven't actually yet been implemented. But if they do actually implement the ones they've committed to, then we are headed for somewhere between 2.5 to 3 degrees of warming. So this would actually be a disaster for the planet. And I guess what we need to decide is when we get out to 2100, we can't decide, well, it's too hot here, we'd rather be here. That decision has to be made now. So the next 5 to 10 years is really when we're going to get the most value from any emissions reduction. And so this is why we really need to get moving on emissions reduction. Okay, so you might be thinking, well, maybe a couple of degrees. What's the big deal about that? And so what I've done here is I've taken this graphic from the IPC summary for policymakers last year, and it looks at the percentage of animal species and seagrass exposed to potentially dangerous temperature conditions. And I just draw your attention to the purple shading here and look at when we get to the 3 and 4 degrees, which is really where we're headed at the moment, that you can see large areas of the tropics and northern Australia impacted by this purple, which is really 100% of species and animals are going to be exposed to potentially lethal temperatures, and they're going to have to either migrate, adapt, or die. So this would be a disaster for animal health. We're far better off if we can try and aim for something like this. And so again, this is the choice we have now for our generation. Do we want to be here, or do we just want to fiddle around and not do very much and ultimately leave for subsequent generations to deal with this disaster for animal health? Okay, so that's the problem. Let's have a look at some of the positive things that we can do as vets about dealing with this. And there's really 2 overall kind of strategic things that we can do as vets, and this is what we're about at Vets for Climate Action, is we can reduce our own emissions, and that's what a net zero strategy is about. But we can also use our influence, and we're actually connected to about 2/3 of the Australian population through our daily contact with the animal owning public. We can try and inspire them to join us, that we have a shared animal health problem, and that we want to try and get a better outcome for the future of animal health. And so we do know from studies that most people do want to do more, but they're just not doing much about it at the moment. And if we look at the social spectrum of ambition and understanding about climate change, we know that we've got about 15 to 20% at one end of the spectrum who are actively doing as much as they possibly can. They understand the problem, they want to do as much as they possibly can. At the other end of the spectrum, there's perhaps 10 to 20% of people who are not doing anything or actively denying the whole problem or don't want to know about it. They all have their reasons, which are perfectly valid to them. But then there is a large section in the middle of people who know it's a problem, but for whatever reason, they're too busy, it's too complex, they just don't know what to do next. And so those are the people that we can inspire to try and take the next step, because they're the ones who want to do more, but just don't know quite what to do. And so that's the group we really want to try and work on. And I'll draw your attention to this book here, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. It's by Australian social researcher, Dr. Rebecca Huntley. And in this book, she explores the various emotions that drive behaviour change in relation to climate change. And in particular, things like emotions such as fear and anger. They're very powerful emotions and they're great at driving change, but only very short-term change. They don't really lead to positive, lasting behaviour change. And in that book, she looks at some of the more positive types of emotions, such as hope and love, and looks at how we might try and connect with these emotions to try and drive change and action to deal with climate change. And particularly love, and when she means love, she means, you know, love of your pets, love of your favorite holiday destination, love of your grandchildren, that kind of thing. We can connect with that emotion and try and build some common drive to actually do more about climate change. And that's our opportunity as veterinarians with our connection with the animal owning public and their love of animals. And the other thing about influencing our clients is whenever we're going to develop a strategy in our practice, we really want to try and get the whole team engaged, because it's the team that's connecting with your clients on a daily basis, and any net zero strategy really has to get team engagement. And I'll emphasize that again later in the presentation. And then the wider long-term aim, particularly in Vets for Climate Action, is to build widespread support for government policy. And policy change is the absolute most powerful tool for widespread change in the community. Once we get legislation enacted, all of a sudden a whole lot of people start to move forward. And we've seen that for things like plastic bags, for example. Okay, with any sort of change that we want to make in our practice, the first thing you want to know is why. Why do we have to make these changes? Why should we do this? Why is it good for our practice? And obviously the first thing, reduce emissions, which I've talked about there. Emissions is the biggest threat to the future of animal health, and we're in the business of animal health. So some sort of emissions reduction strategy is absolutely got to be part of what we offer to the community. There's also increasing community expectations. So, you know, we see widespread in the media advertising and billboards on the freeway. Even when you go to the football, you see discussions about net zero and the various net zero offerings that organisations are now delivering to the community. They've done their research and they realise that the community is now expecting organisations and businesses to be doing something about climate change and net zero. We've also got government regulations, so there's mandatory climate reporting just going through the Parliament, Australian Parliament right now, and it will be requiring businesses of 500 employees or more to start measuring and reporting their carbon footprint, and that will extend down to organisations of 100 employees or more by financial year 27. So this is going to capture a large section of the veterinary community, in particular those practices involved with corporate organisations, but also some of the bigger conglomerates as well. Another reason why it's good to implement a net zero strategy, it's good for your team purpose, and particularly the Gen Zs and millennial generations. There's a really good study from the international accounting firm Deloitte. Every year they do a survey and it covers about over 20,000 participants, and they look at attitudes, and one of the things they look at is attitudes to climate change. And something like about 40% of Gen Z and millennials are now actively looking at the sustainability and net zero credentials of a business that they're going to work for. So it's absolutely an advantage to have something in your offering to prospective employees about doing something about climate change, and that's what a net zero strategy does. And then what we're starting to find is that net zero is actually good for business, good for the profit of the business with new technologies, improved efficiencies and innovation. And also what we're finding is that once you start to review the systems in your practice, you start to do things better and you can deliver a better standard of care. Okay, so now let's get down to more of the detail about a net zero strategy and how it actually works. And I guess the first point there, it's really important that we have management on board. So there's no point in being a really enthusiastic or motivated individual within practice. It's going to be difficult for you to achieve a lot if you haven't got management on board. And so it's good, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, for an individual to be able to know the various benefits, the why it's good for the practice, so that they can actually present a good case to management in their practice and start to bring them on the journey. And there's really 4 steps in a net zero strategy. And the first one is really about the purpose, why. And I guess it's really important that if we're going to make these changes, we need to be clear about why we're doing it. We're doing this to reduce carbon emissions because that's better for the future of animal health. Animal health is our business. So it's important that when you implement these strategies, you keep referencing the why so everyone is clear about why they have to make change. And then the second thing is to have a goal. And it's really important that if you want to know where you're going, you've got to have a goal. And the beauty of a net zero strategy is that you can set an annual reduction to start, but then ultimately set a midterm and then ultimately a net zero by 2050 as your ultimate goal. And then the process, well, the process is really about measuring the carbon within your practice and then identifying where it's coming from in the various systems in your practice, and then prioritizing what you can reduce quickly. And as I mentioned earlier, we need rapid emissions reduction by 2030 if we're going to really have a serious go at getting anywhere near the Paris Agreement. So we need to prioritize and reduce emissions. And then with a net zero strategy, we come back to this annually. We review what we've done over the last year and we go again and try and do better the next year. And it's year on year, ultimately towards a net zero by 2050. And then lastly, the driving force. We know climate change it will continue to get worse. And since it's only going to reinforce your decision to implement your net zero strategy. So when you think, well, it's all getting a bit too hard, you realize it's not going to go away. We're going to have to keep looking to find solutions to some of the difficult challenges we face ahead. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a couple of really key things about our net zero strategy, and this aligns with the broader veterinary strategy about reducing emissions and about engaging the wider community. And engaging the wider community really needs team engagement. So any of the programs that we're going to implement within our net zero strategy will have to achieve emissions reduction and team engagement. And we need team engagement, and that's really critical to the long-term success because it's the team that's going to have to implement the emissions reduction strategies within your practice. You also need the team to be able to connect and communicate with clients to really deliver the extra value that you have from your program and ultimately try and build widespread support for policy change. And then as we get into some of the more difficult emissions, and this is how to deal with some of what we call our scope 3 emissions, so in particular the medical consumables, is that we're going to need to interact with all the stakeholders within the supply chain, and we need to start trying to come up with some creative solutions to some complex problems. And that's what they've seen in the wider industrial sector, non-veterinary sector, is that when they get to these difficult emissions, they need to get everyone involved in the supply chain to try and work out solutions. And I've just highlighted a couple of different programs there and how they vary, for example. So if we're looking at something like solar panels, that's really good for emissions reduction, but there's not much for team engagement in that. And similarly for green power, you can get very rapid emissions reduction in your practice, but it's not going to have anything to do with the team on a day-to-day basis. And then waste and recycling is one that we commonly get people coming to the Climate Care program because they want to do better waste and recycling, and that's great for team engagement. It's a lot of work for only modest emissions reduction. And then there's things like anesthetic gas reduction, which is great for team engagement and is also really good for emissions reduction. So different programs or address these two key components of what we're trying to do in our overall veterinary strategy. And then just as Claire mentioned earlier, the Climate Care program, it is a world first sustainability and net zero program for veterinary clinics. And I'll just draw your attention here to our logo here that we've actually put towards zero. So the focus at the moment, as I said earlier, is really about emissions reduction, and that net zero comes later. So let's at the moment focus on moving towards emission reduction. That's where we should be putting all of our resources. And the Climate Care program is designed to deliver those two important things, emissions reduction and team engagement. And it involves nominating a climate champion within your practice. They access the information via an online learning management system. And it starts out as a journey of sustainability. And as you start to work through the various modules, you start to get an appreciation that all the waste in your practice actually generates some carbon emissions. And then it takes you through to a carbon calculator, which enables you to start measuring your carbon footprint in your practice. And then you can start to choose how you're going to start reducing the carbon emissions in your practice. And as I said earlier, it's carbon emission reduction is what we need to do to address climate change. It's really good if you want to become a climate champion. It's a really good way to learn some valuable leadership skills. And throughout the program, we recognise the importance of change management. And I'll just give a quick plug to the next Vets for Climate Action webinar, which is talking exactly about management of change from the highly acclaimed Lincoln Institute. So I definitely recommend you tune into that one as well. But change management is really about the why, the how, and the repetition needed to embed the change, and then being able to measure and celebrate success. So change management is a really valuable tool to learn in any modern workplace. And then we recognise that the Climate Care program has to be implemented within a business setting, and that it has to deliver on profit, team purpose, and client value. Okay, so just look at the 6 practical steps in the path to net zero in veterinary practice, and this is taken from the paper that I co-authored with 3 others in the Frontiers in Veterinary Science last year. And I guess the most important step in this whole process, I think, is really about getting management on board. And management needs to align your team culture of sustainability with your other business strategies, such as your budgets, your training, your standards of care, your marketing, your recruitment, your sustainability and net zero is going to impact on all of these. And to give you an example of how this works, or how it can go wrong if you don't get it right, is that if you're expecting the team to do better recycling, they get all enthusiastic, they want to get color-coded recycling bins, but there's no budget to purchase them. Or if you're expecting your team to start practicing low carbon anesthesia, but you don't provide adequate training and equipment, and ultimately you'll start to compromise your standard of care. So it's important that management aligns business strategies with your net zero strategy. And then the second part there is about setting targets. And as I said earlier, with your net zero strategy, you need some goals. And the first goal is just to try and get a reduction in your first year. And then ultimately you want to get year-on-year reductions towards a 5 to 10 year target. And if you look, or if you notice in the media, that we've been talking about a 2030 target, and this is our 5 to 10 year target for the nationwide. And now they're starting to talk about a 2035 target as we get closer to 2030. And this is an internationally accepted way of mapping our pathway to net zero by 2050. And that's the Science Based Targets Initiative. And then the next step is to measure our footprint. And there's actually 3 components to the carbon footprint. So, and we call those scopes. So scope 1 is direct emissions produced on site at your practice. And that's things like fossil fuel gas used in heating for hot water and central heating. It's fossil fuels used in practice vehicles that are owned and used by the practice. And there's also anesthetic gases are a significant part of our scope 1 emissions. And these are, as I said, these are all emissions produced on site at your practice. The scope 2 is really emissions due to purchase of electricity by your practice. And in Australia, grid electricity on the mainland is still about half of it is produced by fossil fuels. So it comes with a significant carbon footprint. And then scope 3 is all of the other emissions generated by the activities of your practice. And so this is things like some of the bigger ones would be your employee commute. If your employees are coming by fossil fuel cars, which most of them are at the moment. There's also things like pets cremation, waste to landfill, and conference accommodation and travel. And by far, probably the biggest one in scope 3 is medical consumables. And so the scope 3 emissions generally in other industries are the ones that are the biggest part of your footprint and are the most difficult ones to deal with. And I think that's what we're going to find ultimately in veterinary practice. But there's a lot of opportunities in our scope 1 and 2 at the moment. And I think that's where we should be focusing our energies. The fourth step there is to report. And you might think that's pretty obvious. That once you've got your number, you can report it. So you can just let your team know where the emissions are coming from. But you can also report externally if you're having to comply with the new government regulation, or if you're registering with a public register like Climate Active, which we've done at the Brimbank Vet Clinic, is then there's quite strict guidelines about how you report to them your carbon footprint. And so you can report the actual total amount of your carbon footprint at the practice, or you can actually report your emissions intensity, so your emissions per full-time equivalent vet. And so with the emissions intensity, we can start to compare practice to practice. And then the second most important part of this whole process is really about implementing your reduction program. And that's where the Vets for Climate Action Climate Care program is really designed to give you a whole lot of choices about programs, practical programs that you can implement in your clinic to actually reduce emissions. And then the last step is to collaborate and celebrate. So really to share your wins with your team and also widely on social media so you can connect with your clients. And then we want to repeat annually. So go back to the start, go back to management, look at what you've done, review, and go again year on year, reducing your emissions. And then ultimately, and I've put these arrows fairly weak because I don't think we should be rushing down this path at the moment. But ultimately, as I said earlier, when you get down to about your last 10% of emissions, then you can start to looking at purchasing of carbon credits to become actually net zero. And I think there's certainly an opportunity down the track for veterinarians and to look at purchasing carbon credits that relate to biodiversity, because there's not a lot of support out there in the community for biodiversity restoration, and it's a good opportunity for vets to be able to support that kind of emissions reduction activity. Okay, so let's have a quick look at measuring your carbon footprint. So this is your net zero strategy. You're going to measure your carbon footprint. And at the moment, we'll just stick to scope 1 and 2 in emissions because it's easy to do and you can get a lot of easy wins there. And so what I've done here is put our carbon footprint of the Brimbank Vet Clinic. We've been measuring our carbon footprint for the last 4 years. I've referenced financial year 14 because that was before we'd started to do anything to reduce our carbon footprint. And you can see here the components of the carbon footprint. So we're nearly 50 tonnes of emissions. The green here is fossil fuel gas, beg your pardon, it's electricity purchases from the grid. The brown is our isoflurane anesthetics. And then this blue at the bottom is fossil fuel gas used for heating and central heating hot water and central heating. And so at that time in 2014, we're spending about $10,000 on our energy bills. And then if we fast forward to financial year 22, we'd put in rooftop solar across our entire roof. We'd changed, gotten rid of all of our gas appliances and changed to new generation heat pump hot water service and got rid of our gas clothes dryer. And our energy bills in that year were about $3,800. So we're saving about $6,500, and the practice had grown significantly in this time. So huge win there, a huge financial win. And then if we look at our ongoing efforts to reduce our anaesthetic gas emissions, then if we look at financial year 24, we're delivering better care. We've generated an additional $5,000 in CRI fees. And we've actually saved about $5,000 on drugs that we're using simply because we've changed our anaesthetic regimes. So certainly a significant financial saving, and I think there's more to come. And I guess I've just wanted to highlight the financial benefits as well as the emissions reduction, because if you're going to go to management or you're already in management, then these are the sorts of things that you're going to need to be able to review in a management context if you want to start getting getting a net zero strategy implemented in your practice. So if you're that motivated individual that wants to get management going, this is the sort of information you can take to them because they'll get it. So you can see back here that that our anaesthetic gases, the brown, has been fluctuating a little bit, and so that's really the last of our scope 1 and 2 emissions that we've got to work on. And so what I'd like to do is focus on anaesthetic gases and a net zero strategy in that context. And I did have a chat to a friend who is an engineer who'd been working in the sustainability space for about 10 years. And he said, well, net zero is really about systems review. And so really, I guess, if we apply that in a veterinary context, we start to say, well, what's the emission we're trying to deal with? And what's the system behind that emission? And if we start to analyze that, we start to find there's a whole lot of benefits. And so if we apply that net zero strategy that I talked about earlier, it's first of all having the why. So make sure that that when you start to talk to your team about changing your anaesthetic regimes, that the reason you're doing this is to reduce carbon emissions because that's important for the future of animal health. Then we want to set a goal, and initially your goal is just to try and, I think, just to understand and reduce in the first year. But as we get more practices doing this and get a more of understanding, we can start to set some realistic goals about how much percentage you'd like to be able to achieve based on the anaesthetic regimes that you already have. And then the process, again, the process is about identifying carbon. And in this case, we can measure our use of isoflurane and convert that to a carbon value. We review our systems, and in our practice, we reviewed our entire anaesthetic system from from the beginning with the discussion that you have with the client about the need for anaesthesia, through to the admission procedure, the drugs that we use, the recovery, the discharge, and the follow-up. The whole system of anaesthesia was reviewed, and what they've found in the corporate sector is that when you start to review your systems, immediately you can start to find that there's benefits. And this is what we found with COVID. As we all know, that we were forced to make some changes and found that actually, we don't need to fly interstate to have every meeting, that we can do things like Zoom meetings, which obviously is what we're doing tonight. And then you need to implement changes. And again, important with that change management process that I talked about earlier, the climate champion is now becoming skilled in change management, the why, the how, and the repetition. And I think this repetition to me is a really important part of the change management process, because often what happens is everyone says, yep, we're going to do this, right? This is what we're going to do. And then they drift back to what they're comfortable with for a while. And you need to keep getting people back on track to ultimately get that new behaviour embedded and normalised. And so as a climate champion, you'll recognise that people are going to go back to what they don't get frustrated. Just keep reminding yourself that that's change management, and keep herding them in the direction you want to get to. And ultimately, when you do make some significant achievements, to celebrate your success. And then the important thing about your net zero strategy is that you review and analyse your processes annually. So you've got to keep coming back to it to drive that change year on year and keep working towards that long-term target. Okay, so just a little bit about the impact of anaesthetic gases before I talk a little bit about how it's worked in our practice. And I've taken this data from a really good app that you can download on your phone from Yale University called Yale Gassing Greener. And what we looked at is the carbon emissions for an anaesthetic of a 22 kilogram dog under anaesthetic for 1 hour. And I've put the isoflurane dose rates here of what we were traditionally taught, that you just put everything on 2% and 2 litres a minute, set and forget, always works pretty well. And if you don't think about the carbon emissions, then that's a pretty safe and simple method of anaesthetising patients. The problem is that is generating nearly 10 kilograms of carbon emissions equivalent, compared to something like a propofol CRI, which is delivering about 8 grams, about 8 grams of carbon emissions for the equivalent anaesthesia. So huge difference there. And the other reason you might want to look at your anaesthetic gases, and I'll refer you to a really good website called Safer Vets. And they have a lot of information on health and safety within the veterinary profession. But there are significant health risks about chronic exposure to isoflurane. And so I know a lot of you will have scavenger systems within your practice, but there's also significant amounts of isoflurane exhaled in the recovery room and from leakages from your systems as you change positions of animals and keep removing them on and off the circuit. So there are exposure, particularly to people that are pregnant, have also concerns about even low-level exposure to isoflurane in the atmosphere. So another good reason to maybe look at alternatives. And so we haven't looked at our experience of anaesthetic reduction in our practice at the Brimbank Vet Clinic. And so it was really financial year 21 that we first measured our carbon footprint. You can see here, and our emissions there due to anaesthetic gases was about 8.5 tonnes. So it's nearly 10% of our carbon footprint in that year. And so what we did in our first year is of trying to reduce emissions is we just looked at using appropriate flow rates. So not everything went on 2 litres a minute. We started to tune the flow rate down according to the patient's size. And already we've got a 10 or 15% reduction. And next year, you can see actually we went up, and there's a number of reasons for that. Probably the couple of reasons, the practice grew quite a bit after COVID. And also we were distracted on other sustainability issues, which was going paperless in the hospital system with our new hospital management system. And so that actually took quite a lot of process change and energy. And I guess it's important, if you are going to change your anaesthetic regimes, that you do this carefully and systematically, and that you don't get distracted by other programs in the hospital. But once we'd embedded that and we did our emissions summary again in this year, financial 23, we realised that we needed to do something much more significant, and that's when we did the full systems review from the conversation through to the discharge, and looked at our anaesthesia, and we've made a number of changes, and we've actually more than halved our emissions from anaesthetic gases in the last year. So things like more CRIs, we did some training on medetomidine pre-meds. We used to use ACE and methadone. Now we use medetomidine methadone. And we use a lot more CRIs, local anaesthetics, total intravenous and partial intravenous anaesthesia. So all that mix has, as I said earlier, has generated significant financial benefits, and also we're delivering a lot better anaesthesia because the team is a lot more engaged. So just running through some of the benefits that we've experienced by having a really good look at our anaesthesia systems in practice. Obviously, we've got those emissions reductions, which I mentioned earlier, more CRIs, more analgesia. Medetomidine is a much better pre-med for analgesia. Also less anxiety, which is of course better for the team because we don't have a lot of patients vocalizing and soiling cages because they're so anxious. And also better for the owners because they can see their patients are more relaxed. We've also taken a serious look and introduced capnography. Now, I know all the anaesthetists say, well, we should have that already, but it has taken us a little while. But it's the net zero strategy that's ultimately pushed us to look into this more seriously and implement some capnography. And if you want to do safe low flow rates, then you need to start looking at capnography. We've had some team innovation, so we've developed our CALM admission protocol, we like to call it, and this is our system whereby we've identified that there are a lot of anxious patients out there, particularly the French bulldogs and cavoodles, and often the owners are just as anxious as the dog. And when you mention that you're going to anaesthetize their patient, all of a sudden there's a sort of a gasp that this is all going to be too dangerous, and how will the patient cope in a strange environment. And so what we've done is we now identify them as a CALM admission, and when we do that, the whole team knows what that means. And so we align that patient to arrive at a time that suits them and us in the morning. We pre-med them with a medetomidine pre-med while they're present. When the patient goes down, which is usually about 5 or 10 minutes, we take them straight through, and we have the hospital ready to go to do that procedure straight away. And then as soon as they've recovered, we ring the owner and get them to come and pick it up. So they're not spending the whole day waiting around on the hospital list for the morning. We align the list with the needs of the owner and the patient. And so it's a mild change, but it's made a huge difference in our practice. Another learning is that you can actually learn some really good stuff from new graduates. So old dogs can learn new tricks like me. So when I suggested to our team that, hey, we should look at some medetomidine pre-meds, our new graduate said, well, yeah, that's what we learn at university. That's what we thought we were going to do. And so she was able to put together a really good PowerPoint presentation to our team on the benefits of medetomidine pre-meds and how they differ from the ACE methadone and how we need to understand and deal with that. But they're actually in better shape for anaesthesia, even though they look a lot more sedated and the heart rate is different. So it was a big learning curve for our team, but it's been a huge benefit for our practice. And it's enabled to use significantly less anaesthetics, anaesthetic agents rather. The other learning is that change does take time, so don't rush this. We've got plenty of time to get these things right and gradually work through those. And then the last thing is that the emissions, as you saw previously, they don't always go down and stay down. You need to be honest in your reporting and keep good records as to what you did and what the response was, and then go again in the next year to get further emissions reduction. And so, as I said, Net Zero is really about systems review. So then if we've had such good success with reviewing our anaesthetic systems, then the question is, well, what other systems could we start looking at and applying a systems review to that to see what we could get out of that. And one of the Scope 3 emissions that we're having to deal with now is PETS cremation. That's probably one of the biggest ones of our Scope 3 emissions that we're likely to be able to do something about. And so the question is, well, if the emission is PET's cremation, what is the system leading up to the euthanasia and disposal of that body? And that, I suppose, looks at your end-of-life care. And so we're starting to talk to the palliative care vets about how we can look at doing better end-of-life care as part of our understanding about the steps leading up to PET's cremation. So that's another system we could start to look at. Another system is your medical, or sorry, emission that we need to deal with is medical consumables and waste to landfill. So this is the largest part of our Scope 3 emissions by a long shot, is medical consumables. It's going to be a difficult one to solve. And so if we look at the systems that involve us acquiring medical consumables and then where they go, that's our waste. If you combine those two, then we start to look at the purchase, delivery, packaging, recycle, disposal, and supply chain adequacy. And so that supply chain is what I was talking about before, is really engaging all the stakeholders in the supply chain to try and find solutions to some of these more difficult Scope 3 emissions. An interesting one of the most rapidly growing emissions in our practice is information technology. And so even though we thought we were really clever by going paperless, that actually online IT systems and particularly AI actually consume huge amounts of electricity. And so that needs to be factored into your carbon footprint. And so I was talking to an IT professional at the ASABA conference last week and talking about this problem and starting to question, well, how much data do we actually need to store? And then she said, well, actually, you can dump a whole lot of data out of your practice management system and actually make it run faster. So once you start to look into these things and start to, from a carbon point of view, you can make changes that actually benefit your practice. And so I think that's something that we'll need to explore more and more, particularly with the rapid development of AI technologies. And I've just put a picture here of, this is one of the things that we learn in the climate care program, is about when you have a lunch and learn, is getting your suppliers to do a quick presentation on what their company is doing about sustainability. And so this really pushes back to the companies and suppliers to say, well, we think this is important. What are you doing to show that you think it's important too? And ultimately try and build some more appetite for change and sustainability. Okay, so another initiative we're trying to get up at Vets for Climate Action this October is Zero October or Zero October. It's really about making net zero sustainability month in the veterinary profession. We already have August designated as dental month, so there's no reason why October couldn't become our net zero and sustainability month. And so kind of activities that we think would be useful within that month is your annual reporting of your admissions to your team, to your clients, and external reporting. So October gives you a chance to accumulate your power supply and anaesthetic usage over the last financial year, gather that data, and with your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, there's only about half a dozen items to calculate. And so you can start getting into the rhythm of looking at your carbon footprint each year and reporting to your team, but also potentially you could report to someone like Vets for Climate Action. We could start publishing what practices are doing and start to get a bit of interest, and ultimately some competition and comparison would be ideal. You might want to do a few team focused events. So as I said earlier, you really, with our overall strategy as vets, we want admissions reduction, but we also want team engagement. So doing some activities within your practice that might engage your team in sustainability. And the one that works really well with us is our e-waste pickup for staff, but also you might have things like a plastic-free lunch, or you can come up with your own sustainability initiatives. But it's important that whatever you choose, that you talk about at your team meetings and get everyone to have some buy-in so that everyone is on board, rather than making it a drag because it's been imposed on them. And then it's also good if you can do some sort of outward-facing events. So whether you want to have a sustainable raffle, you can get clients to return unused or unwanted medications, and so you can get disposal containers from your local pharmacy that will allow you to accumulate medications that then go back to them, and then it's disposed of through the human pharmaceutical networks. Use your social media connections to promote the connection between animal health, climate health, and your activities, and then life stage boards, which I mentioned earlier. But also push back to your suppliers, get your reps involved, and get some support from them so that we can start to get the whole of the industry collaborating to try and deal with this problem, because there is still a whole lot to learn as we start to navigate this space. But certainly this is something we'd like to make an annual event. And so I really like the rule of threes. If you just want to get started, just choose 3 really simple things for October. And one could be measure and report your carbon footprint. So just sign up to the Climate Care program, use the carbon calculator, and you can get that calculation done pretty quickly. Choose one emissions reduction goal, and a really good one is to just change to a green power provider, and you can get a huge reduction in your emissions immediately. And then one team engagement activity, and this is what I was talking about, having an e-waste day. Works really well in our practice. We do it at least once a year. So we all know that e-waste accumulates around your practice, and also everyone's got e-waste accumulating at home. So we have a 2-week period where everyone can bring in their e-waste. We gather the stuff around the practice, and then we get an e-waste recycler to come in and pick it up. So that's a really good one to do as well. Okay, so just maybe a few goals that we could set for the profession. I think that there's certainly opportunity for the profession to get significant reductions in scope 1 and 2 by 2030, and potentially we could even get a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 if we all get started and really get stuck into this. So starting with your scope 1 and 2 emissions, the existing technologies are there, the heat pump technologies, the new green technologies. There's lots of alternative anesthetic technologies out there that enable us to get really significant reductions in this sector. But we also need some awareness within the profession that we need to get moving on this. We can move on this, and what the benefits are of implementing a net zero strategy in practice. And then the other thing I think it would be good to aim for is to start getting some stakeholder task force happening. This is what they do in other sectors when they've got difficult emissions to solve. And in particularly with anesthesia, there's a lot of change required. There's conflicting information as to whether or not you should go to total intravenous or whether you should be changing your anesthetic gas equipment to other sorts of anesthetic gas equipment. And so it would be good to have some clear guidance and directions from particularly the specialists, but also the other stakeholders in the supply chain, the manufacturers, the equipment providers, etc., to say, well, we've all got a stake in this, and this is how we recommend that you as a practitioner can go about getting to net zero with your anesthesia. So a stakeholder task force would be great for that, and then we could extend that out to other emissions like PET cremation or information technology, for example. So lots and lots of stuff to be explored, lots of opportunities out there, but we just need the drive and the resources to get these things going. Okay, so that really concludes the presentation for tonight. So just the brief summary, a few take-homes from tonight. Really, animal health needs climate health. The biggest threat to the future of animal health is climate change. Animal health is absolutely our core business, and so we need to be offering something about doing something about climate change as part of our offering to deal with animal health to the public. Love your pet, love your planet. So using that powerful positive emotion, that connection with animals to make the connection between animal health and climate change, and using our connection to the animal owners and carers in the public, that we all need to do more because we have a shared responsibility to the future of animal health. And I really like this, this photograph here, which is from the Greater Springfields Vets Life Stage Boards. And it kind of highlights 2 groups that are really relying on us. There's animals, and there's our children and grandchildren are really relying on us to do something. And so when our grandchildren, when it comes to 2050 and they ask us, well, what were you doing in the 2020s when you knew that we had to move quickly on climate change? What I'm hoping is you'll say, well, we implemented a really good net zero strategy in our practice. And we know that a net zero strategy delivers significant emissions reductions. It gets the team engaged and it's good for your business. It's good for profit, team purpose, and client value. Net zero is really about systems review, and we start to get a whole lot of spin-off benefits once we start to look at our systems review, and then we also get a whole lot of opportunities and once we make those changes. And lastly, if all of this seems just a little bit too complex, or you're just not quite sure where to start, then I'd highly recommend you sign up to the Vets for Climate Action Climate Care Program. We make it easy for you, and you can start your sustainability journey and ultimately your path to net zero in practice. So that concludes my presentation tonight, Claire. So I leave that QR code there. If anyone wants to have a look at it, you can click on that and register for the Climate Care Program. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time tonight.
Thank you once again, Jeremy. That was a brilliant presentation, extremely informative. We do have a couple of questions. I'm aware of the time, so we'd love to hear what questions you have. The first question we have, Jeremy, is from Agnes, and Agnes has said, where did you find the carbon emissions for veterinary intravenous anaesthetics? Are there references somewhere?
Yeah, well, I've really just gone by the gas ingreener, the Yale gas ingreener, because they do look at intravenous Alfaxan and Propofol there. So, but I guess what we would really like from manufacturers, and this is another thing that would come out of a stakeholder group task force, is for manufacturers to provide us with a life cycle assessment of all the products we use, so we know what the carbon intensity is of that product, and then we can make decisions about what is best. But yeah, just going from the Gas Ingreener app is probably the main source. And also there's an excellent webinar on the Vets for Climate Action website by Dr. Donna White from the Sydney Pain Management Clinic, and she goes through a whole lot of intravenous alternatives to reduce your emissions, and so that's a really good resource as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. Just to let everyone know, I did pop in the chat as well. If you scroll up, we have Professor Mark Howden's masterclass there, which had a lot of the graphs that Jeremy referred to in there. I've popped the link to Rebecca Huntley's book in there too, the link to register for our September masterclass, and the link that Jeremy just referred to with Donna's masterclass and Jeremy together, the carbon cost of veterinary anaesthesia as well. Jeremy, we have a question from Sol. Should we consider changing some of the food we give our hospital patients to take emissions into account?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think, everything's on the table. When we do the carbon audit, pet food isn't part of our footprint if it's something that we sell to a client, but pet food used within the hospital for feeding your patients is part of your carbon footprint. I guess in our practice, that's a very, very small amount because most patients are in for anaesthetics and consequently not being fed. But there are some newer foods coming out. There's Leica pet foods that are actually carbon positive. And there's also pet foods that are made out of insect protein, which have a much reduced carbon footprint as well. So that space is rapidly evolving. But yeah, look, absolutely good question. But it's probably a very small part of your emissions. And there's a lot of, once you do your carbon footprint, there's a lot of bigger areas that you could work on first to achieve significant emissions reduction.
Wonderful. I hope that answered that for you, Sol. Peter has said, Jeremy, great presentation. We're just wondering how the 9.9 kilograms of carbon emissions from an hour's gas anesthesia is achieved. Thanks.
Yeah, so what they do with measuring your carbon emissions is that all of the emissions from your practice are converted to a carbon equivalent. So gases that actually contribute to global warming have what's called a global warming potential. And so carbon dioxide is one. We all know methane is a greenhouse gas, and it has a global warming potential of about 30. Anesthetic gases such as isoflurane has a carbon emission of about 550. So it's very, very much higher than a lot of other gases that contribute to global warming. And so in fact, if you want to know more detail about that, I'd strongly recommend you go to Donna's webinar, because she talks about the actual atmospheric chemistry of gases that contribute to global warming and how they actually trap heat. But that's the calculation, and so once you convert that out, it becomes an equivalent of 9.9 kilograms of carbon emissions equivalent.
Unreal. Thanks for that question, Peter, and thanks for that answer, Jeremy. Just to mention again, I have popped the link up further in the chat to that masterclass that Jeremy just referred to with Donna. We'd love to hear of any last questions anyone has. I will be popping all those links into the email you will receive tomorrow, which will include the recording of tonight's masterclass. There is an email if you are not comfortable popping your question in the chat or asking it now, and that email is info@vfca.org.au. If there aren't any more questions, I will wrap it up here. Once again, thank you all so much for attending our masterclass. Jeremy, I can't thank you enough. Your presentations are always so informative and so interesting. I always learn something new, and I work here, so thank you so much. I know everyone agrees. There's a lot of positive feedback in the chat thanking you for that presentation. So once again, thank you.
Great, thank you very much.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, good night.